Hey everyone, Shane here with eTrailer.com. Today I have a 2013 Ford F-150 and I'm going to walk you through how to install the airlift load control single path analog air compressor. There are different types of air compressors out there. You have single path analog, which we have here, you have dual path, and you also have wireless. In my professional opinion, I like the wireless myself. They're a little bit easier to install. However, that being said, this analog setup that we have put on this truck today is pretty straightforward and pretty easy. They kind of make it a little bit easier and set it up for you, so it's pretty easy to make all your connections. What are the purposes of having an air compressor? Well, when we have to air up our bags, we put a load on, we have to air up our bags. If we don't have an air compressor, we have to come to the valve for each bag. We have to air up each one. We have to have a gauge. We have to check it, figure out how much air pressure we got on there, and keep adding. With having a system set up inside the vehicle, all we're doing is we're pushing a button, watching the gauge, and we can set our air pressure. Not only that, but when we're done, we can also release our air pressure. Nice thing about this system is it also has a low pressure regulator. Our bags require at least 5 psi in them. The reason they require 5 psi is to keep pressure on the bag. The reason you want pressure on the bag at all times is so the bag doesn't get soft and the rubber doesn't deteriorate. The low pressure regulator, what it does is, let's say the weather changes, it gets a little bit colder. You could potentially lose a little bit of air pressure inside that bag. When you turn the key on, it's automatically going to kick your compressor on if that pressure is dropped and air the bags up to that minimum low pressure setting. This install, again, is pretty simple. Let's go ahead and take a walk over to the passenger side and I'll show you where I installed this one. Right up here on my frame wheel. On the driver's side, there's a bunch of wiring and stuff, so it was kind of hard to put it on there, but they do give you enough cable and wiring to get it mounted. It's going to come with the self-tapping screws to get it installed. You'll notice the vent here. You want to make sure it's well vented. We don't have to worry about it getting clogged up or anything like that. This is going to come with all of your wires, all of your lines, anything like that to get it installed. Once you get this installed, then you're going to have to determine where you're going to put your gauge inside the vehicle. This is what our gauge is going to look like inside the vehicle. Nice white screen, so it's easy to see during the day. It's also going to be lit, so we'll be able to see it at night. We're going to have a max PSI of 100, and again, a minimum PSI of 5. This is a momentary switch for your bag, and this is going to be your pressure release valve. So what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and release the pressure. There's about 45 PSI in there now. I'm going to go ahead and release the pressure, and I'm going to show you what the system does when it's below that 5 PSI when we turn the key on. I'm going to let all the air out and turn the key on, and you'll hear the compressor kick on. Once it gets to that 5 psi minimum, it automatically shuts off. The light feature allows us to illuminate the screen when we're driving at night. We run it right to a light switch, so when we turn on our running lights, you can see it's going to light up the screen. Nice. It's a nice soft light. It's not real bright, so we don't have to worry about it causing a disturbance inside the vehicle while we're driving. As I mentioned, the installation is going to be fairly simple for an analog system compared to some of the other analog setups out there. Airlift makes it pretty easy. Again, they have their wires already set up with their airlines on what goes where. Mount your compressor. It's going to have the line that connects to it and runs inside. It's going to have a wire connected to it. They tell you where to connect it on the light. And your low pressure sensor mounts to the back of the gauge and then connects to the line that runs to your compressor. Other than that, you're just connecting your T-fittings to the back in between your bags. Other than that, it's pretty simple. You really don't have a whole lot like you do with some of the other ones to get it set up. Now that we've gone over some of the features, let's walk you through how to get it installed. First, we're going to take our gauge. We're going to take this cable with our low pressure valve on it. This end, we're going to hook it into this barb fitting on the back of our gauge. I'm going to make sure it goes over the barb end. The two prongs on the back of our switch, we're going to take the yellow spade connector. It's going to go to this top one. I'm sorry, this top one. Then our blue one will go into the remaining one. Now we need to determine where you're going to mount your gauge. Typically, right in this area is probably a good spot. It's going to come with self-tapping screws that we can mount that right there. Before we do that, we need to get this line ran inside. This end is going to stay outside. The opposite end with the bare hose or airline tube in this fitting, we need to get it up inside. There's a grommet right down underneath that we can pass it up through. So we're going to start by pulling this threshold panel off, and it should just pull up. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to pull up this rubber seal here, because it goes over the top of the clip on this outside edge. We'll just set this aside for now. We're going to pull up our carpet, and there's your grommet. We're going to cut a little slice in it, and we'll pass that end with that connector up through that. Just like that. Next, we're going to pop off this kick panel. Should just be able to just pull it out, and then we'll set it aside. We're going to take this line, we're going to run it right up the edge of our carpet right here, kind of following our factory wiring. We'll get it up enough on the back side. We're going to take the end of our airline tube, we're going to put it into the other end of our low pressure valve. We're going to push it in, give it a little tug, make sure it's in there. We're going to take this line, and it's going to go right there. So to determine where we're going to mount our compressor, there's not a whole lot of room on our frame rail on our driver's side. There's factory wiring that runs down here. Plus you have your emergency brake cable and some other lines. So what I'm doing is I'm going to mount it on the passenger side, but to get our line over there, we need to make sure we're staying away from anything hot or moving. Right above our fuel tank, there's actually a support beam that runs right over and across. So what I did is a hard line right here. I zip tied it right there. That support beam runs right here. This is our support beam. My line actually runs right over the top of it. You can see where I've got it here. I'll get the slack out of it later, but ideally this is where we're going to put it, and then I'm going to mount my compressor right here on the frame rail. In your kit, you're going to get some self-tapping screws, some large ones. We're going to try to get our self-tappers to go in through the frame rail. If they don't, we might have to come back and drill a hole out first. If the self-tapper gets too hot, the head will break off, and then you're going to have to get a new one and find somewhere else to put it. But we'll try it out. And you can see I'm using a short driver. There's not a whole lot of room. This customer has steps on here, so it makes it a little bit difficult. But in a sense, that's how it's going to go on. We'll go ahead and get our 3 remaining self-tappers put in. So now that we have our compressor mounted, we had a lot of extra slack in our line that we need to figure out what we're going to do with it. There's nowhere really to zip tie it up in this area or on the outside. So what I did is I took this fitting off, and it's very easy. You just push the line, and this little ring right here, you push it in and then pull the line out. I fed my line with that wire through the hat channel here. There's a gap right underneath the body. Fed it through there, went over top the frame. This support brace, it's also hollow, so I ran it through like that. We'll take this, put it back on the line, put that back on our line, and the short end, then hook right into that barb fitting on our compressor. There's 2 barbs on it. I'm going to try and get it over both of them. That way our line stays up. It's not hanging down. We don't have to worry about it getting damaged. On your compressor, you're going to have a red and black wire. We're going to take the black wire and we're going to ground it to the frame rail. It's a good idea to take a flathead screwdriver and scrape off the paint or the coating that's on the frame so you know you have a good ground. Self-tapper is not going to come with your kit for this. You will have to provide that yourself. Now we're going to take our red wire coming from our compressor, our red wire coming from our air line that we hooked in. We're going to plug them 2 together. And we're going to run some electrical tape around the connections. Now it's not, the airline is not touching it. It's probably not going to, but to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and put a little piece of wire loom on there. It doesn't come in your kit. You can find some here at E-Trailer. I'm going to take the rest of my red wire so it's not just hanging. And I'm going to zip tie it to this airline right here. For this line that's running through this outside brace, I went ahead and put some wire loom on it just so the wire in this metal, the metal doesn't rub a bare spot in that wire and cause a short. You're going to get some extra air line in your kit. We're going to go from the T-fitting that was by our compressor, we're going to run it back to our passenger side airbag, or in that vicinity. Push it in until you kind of feel it pop a little bit. Give it a little tug, and we can route our line back. Same thing with this, we want to make sure we're staying away from anything hot or moving. For this, we should be able to run it for the most part and just follow the top of our frame rail. We're going to have a few loose T-fittings that look like this in your kit. Where our line runs out of our airbag back to our inflation valve, we need to insert 1 T-fitting on each line. Make sure you deflate your bags first. And cut that line. Insert one side of the tube, and of course the other side, just like that. Then we can run a zip tie. Once we're done, we'll keep that line up. Now we're going to repeat that on the other side. Now my line coming from my compressor only goes to about here, but I had a bunch of line looped up here going out to my inflation valve. Since it has to go in here, what I did is I just cut it to length, add in a T-connector, another T-connector coming from my main line off my compressor. Some of that extra, I ran it from here over to my driver's side, and then we have some extra here. I'm going to take it, insert it here, and run it into that fitting. Next thing we're going to do is on the end of this, you're going to have a red wire. It's going to have a spade connector. Most of the time, these are not going to be long enough to get to a fuse panel. This has to go to a 12-volt power source. On the passenger side, in front of the door, passenger side kick panel, the panel comes off and there's a fuse panel there, so what we need to do is we need to extend this. So we're going to cut this end off. Strip back the end. Butt connector is going to come in your kit. You're going to have some extra red wire and extra black wire. We're going to take our red, we're going to strip back one end, add it into our butt connector. We'll take some electrical tape, put it on that, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take this end and we're going to run it under our dash, straight across, and over to the passenger side. This panel right here actually pops off. And what I did is I took an airline tube. You don't necessarily have to use an airline tube. You can use a wire hanger or anything, and you can pass it straight over there. And what makes it nice is where I'm passing it through, it's right up against the dash, so the wire, when it's running across, we can actually take it and tuck it up underneath so it stays out of the way. So now to pop the panel off, you just pull it off. These are our fuses. What we need to look for is either a 15 amp or a 20 amp fuse that is only powered when the ignition is on. Have you noticed? We don't have the ignition on. These are all powered. We come right up here. It's going to be fuse number 32. This is 15 amp fuse here. And this is for our accessories, our power windows, power locks, mirrors. We don't have any power. But if we turn the ignition to the accessory on position, this will come on. And that's what we want. The reason we want that is we don't want our compressor to have power running to it all the time. We only want it to have power when the ignition is turned on. So we'll go ahead and put the key in the ignition, turn it on to the accessory on position. Make sure we have power to it. Okay, now we'll take the key out. What we're going to do is we're going to pull that fuse, and we need to find the hot side. I'm going to take some needle nose pliers. We'll pop that fuse out. So because the fuses are micro fuses, we're not going to be able to use the taps that come in the kit. We're going to have to use a fuse holder like this, and this is for the micro fuses. The fuse that we took out, we're going to install on one, and we're going to have to add one into the top in order for this connector to function. Like that, we'll take our wire that we ran across, we're going to route it up under the dash or behind the carpet, however you really want to run it. Once we get it long enough, we're going to cut the end and we're going to splice it into this butt connector, and then we're going to plug that into that slot. On the bottom of our dash, there's a couple of clips that have holes in them. I just ran my wire across, ran a zip tie in each one, ran my wire over, and zip tied it to some factory wiring up here that'll hold it up in the air, so it's up behind the dash. It's hidden. We added on our fuse holder. We'll run some tape around there. We're going to plug it in that slot and insert our fuses. Next, we're going to do the power and ground for our light. We need to find a light source. So if we come right up here where our factory light is, or factory switch is, this panel, we can just pop it off. And our plug is right here. This brown wire here, I believe is going to be our light source, so that our light for our gauge only comes on when we turn the switch on. We'll test it. Let's with it off. Go ahead and turn our lights on. Okay. Now that we know that's our wire, what we need to do is our remaining red wire that we cut off from running over to our fuse. We're going to strip one end. We're going to add one of the included spade connectors. It's going to hook onto one of the prongs on the back of our light. We're going to take this wire, we're going to route it up under our dash, right through here. We're going to take our black wire, strip back one end, add on the other spade connector, hook it into the other prong on the light, and that's going to be our ground, which we will run that last. But now that we have all of our connections made, we can go ahead and mount this where we want. I'm going to mount it right over here. That way we can see it while we're sitting in the seat. The kit's going to come with some self-tappers. However, the self-tappers are not going to be long enough to hold it on the bottom of this panel here. So I'm using a little bit longer self-tappers to get that mounted in place. So what I did is, because this thing was sitting like this, the back here was hitting this bottom edge. What I did is I just took a pair of vice grips and I just bent the tabs on the end just a little bit where it'll sit more like this rather than like this. Make it a little bit easier to see, and it'll mount straight. Now we'll take our self-tapper, once we get that mounted, we have all our connections made, we can start cleaning up our install. We are still going to have to connect our low temperature sensor to the line and wire that we pulled up from the bottom. And it's simply going to plug into that T-fitting, and then our red wire is going to plug in right there. What I want to do first before I make that connection though, is I want to get all these mounted up in here. Make sure that I'm going to have enough here, because we have plenty underneath. If I have to, I can go down and pull a little bit of extra to come up with it. Once we get all this cleaned up, tucked up back behind the dash where it's not showing, we'll come back, we'll cut our wire going to our light down to size so we don't have a whole bunch of extra. And then our ground wire, we're going to actually have to route it back behind or over the top of our emergency brake cable and down this power line or power wire here, factory lines, and there's a factory ground right back here on this side wall. So we'll make those connections after I get it all cleaned up to make sure we have enough wire. So my wires, there's a factory bundle of wires that run right across the inner side of the dash. So I added some wire loom on it just to help keep the wires together and zip tied it to that factory wiring. My airline tube and my wire coming up from under the floor, I ran it behind my hood release cable to this factory wiring. I zip tied it up here so it stays out of the way of my emergency brake pedal. My ground wire for my light, there's a factory stud right here at the ground. The ring terminal that comes in the kit's probably not going to fit, so I'll be putting a different one on. You'll have to put a different one on if you're going to use that. If not, take a self-tapper and you can just go right into this wall. I like to not put holes in if I don't have to. So we'll go ahead, I can go ahead and cut this down. Strip it back. And again, I'm going to be putting a bigger ring terminal on it that will fit that stud. That stud uses an 8mm socket. Before I put that on, I'm going to go ahead and get my power wire ran to my switch up top. Go ahead, cut that wire down to size. And for this wire, we're going to have a spade connector, a quick splice connector. So we're going to add it onto our wire. We'll take our red wire, we're going to insert it into our quick splice connector till it bottoms out. Go ahead and get that onto our wire for a light. Take a pair of pliers. We're going to push down the center. Close that off, and then we can reinstall our panel. Take our 8mm socket, remove our ground stud. Add on our ring terminal, and then reinstall the ground stud. Once we get all that connected, we can reinstall our panels. Now that we've got everything hooked up, we'll go ahead and turn our key to the accessory on position and we'll test it out. Now that we know it's working, we're going to go ahead and add about 40 to 45 psi. We're going to check all of our connections for our lines in the back. We're going to spray them down with some soapy water and make sure nothing's leaking. When we spray soapy water, and what we're looking for is we're looking for bubbles to form around the ends. We're going to see if that's actually air bubbles forming. Or if, yep. So they see right there. So you look right there, you can see those air bubbles forming. Before I take that out though, I'm going to go ahead and spray my other lines down, check those out, and then we can come back to this and fix this one. Now before we disconnect that line and check the end of it, we need to make sure we let the air out of our bags. So I don't know if you can see it, but right about there, there's a little nick in it. And that could cause it to leak. So what we're going to do, and there's actually a burr right there too. So what we're going to do is I'm going to cut a little bit of that end off, make sure it's flush, we'll reinsert it and test it again. And it looks like we have fixed the problem. Once you get that done, fix any other lines that may have a slight leak in them, and you're ready to go. Once you fix any of your lines, you can go ahead and reinstall your spare tire and you're ready to go. It's going to do it for a look at and installation on the Airlift load control single path analog air compressor on the 2013 Ford F-150.